In this video, I'll address each item in our Tools menu, conveniently located in our Quick Access menu. If I hover my mouse over the icon there, we'll see the Tooltip Tools menu. I'm going to left-click that icon, which is going to bring down the drop-down menu, and of course, each item will have a corresponding sub-menu. Now I'm going to go in order here for convenience and video purposes. If I hover my mouse over altitude grid, the sub-menu will pop out, and we're going to also go through these in order as well. The first of which is going to be considered our snap mode. So for example, we're simply saying where do we want the altitude to actually connect to. First, before I address that, let me actually discuss what the altitude grid indeed is. It helps us to determine the perceived value of whatever measurements we are taking based on our settings here. Now, if you look to the right side of the chart here, you'll see one column with 4 grids, starting above, which is red, going into an orange color, darker green, as well as a brighter green color towards the bottom. As you can see here, we have the zones option selected, which means that it is going to connect to the closest supply and demand zone. And that's what you're seeing here. You're seeing it snap to the top of the supply zone as well to the bottom of the demand zone. Now, if I were to make an alteration here to one of the additional options, first of which being all data, that is indeed going to snap to all of the data in which you have loaded for this particular instrument, in this case, the dollar Canadian Forex spot market. So I'm going to go ahead and do that by left-clicking, and as you can see, the altitude grid over here has indeed changed, and we can no longer see that bottom and or 4th grid within the column. That is because it is also interpreting previous data which you cannot see on the chart. If I select Visible, you can also see something a bit different here. Visible is also connecting to the top of supply, however, that is irrelevant. That supply level is not required to be there. It will connect to the high and the low values in which is on your chart. Currently, we can see all of this visible data here. So what it is doing is using the lowest low there, and as you can see, it's snapping to this, as well as the highest high, and it's snapping there as well. So we have all data visible as well as the zones option. If the zones option is selected, and this is indeed required, otherwise this becomes irrelevant. That's important. Let me repeat that. The only time in which the second option here is necessary or relevant in any way is if zones is selected. This is simply asking you, if we're going to snap to the zones, which zones would you wish for me to snap to? In other words, the primary or the secondary. As you can see here, we have our secondary zones being used. We can simply make the alteration and it will indeed snap to our primary. Moving on, we have our simple toggles being on or off, so we can, of course, remove and or show the grid at any time. We do have the capabilities of resizing the grid. So if I wanted to go over, I could manually grab the top of this and alter the grid in itself. We can disable that functionality at any time by simply left-clicking that option. Moving forward, we have our price labels, which of course we can toggle on or off at any time, as well as text labels that we may toggle on or off at any time. Finally, we have a reset grid option. This becomes usable if we've made alterations to the zone. For example, as you can see here, we have the resize grid option enabled. If I were to go manually alter the altitude grid, then I decided I wanted it to go back to its original state, I could simply come here, left-click Reset Grid, and indeed it would go back to the way it was originally set. The next item in our list is going to be the continuation, and if I move down and hover my mouse there, we'll see the sub-menu. Of course, I have my simple toggles here as well. I can toggle them on or off at any time. As we can see down here, there's a red label. So there's a line followed by, of course, a label with the actual value. And as you may or may not be able to see there, there is a label indicating that is a DBD. We can see here, if I were to disable that, notice that that label is being removed from the price chart. And I can do that at any time. I would want to note here that the show RBR and show DBD are real-time and or active continuation patterns, whereas the historical RBR and DBD are indeed considered historical and or violated. So the RBRs and DBDs are continuation patterns that typically occur in the midst of moves. That's to say in the middle. If we go through and we look at these lines, we can see that this line occurred after a move up and was eventually invalidated, which we will discuss here momentarily. And we can see many green lines as well as red lines, as you can see here. Those are color-coded in the settings, and we'll cover that throughout the remainder of the presentation as well. We can continue moving forward. If we were to disable these, the historical RBRs, you can see those are flickering off as well as back on with that simple toggle, the same with the historical DBDs. Next, we have extend labels. As you can see, currently we have those set to on. However, if I disable that, take note of the label here, I can extend that to the right side of my chart. So if I were to move or shift the price action to the left, that label is going to remain right justified. That's simply a visual aesthetic. Now, if we move into our text input fields here and we hover over that, we can see a tooltip there which states min bars. That is simply stating this is the input field for the minimum amount of bars in order to require that particular price pattern. If we move down and hover our mouse, we're going to see the tooltip of max bars. So we're indicating here that we want to see continuation patterns between 1 and 6 bars. If, however, it goes beyond that, then we want to invalidate that pattern. I did mention earlier in this video that we would discuss that. So if we go back down to this particular RBR price pattern here, we can see that it stops plotting. And the simple reason for that is because we've indicated that we do not want to see more than 6 bars. If we make an alteration here outside of the toggles, in other words, if I make an alteration to the value in itself in any way, I would left click reload settings and it would indeed reload the chart with the appropriate settings that we've now input. Our fib zones I'm going to move rather swiftly through, as this will be covered in another video of our draw tools. Suffice to say, for now, we'll go through the drop-down menu here. We have an extend option, which will of course extend our fib zones to the right. It will justify them to the right, if you will. We have many options here, such as price labels, and you're probably getting the gist of it at this point. Price labels will indeed be removed or capable of being removed for each item. We also have the percentage labels option, so we can show those values or we can show it as a percentage. And then of course we have the toggles, zone 1 through 6, and as I mentioned, those can be toggled on or off at any time, but we will be discussing this further through the drawing tools section of this presentation. Let's go ahead and look at our market structure. This is a rather simple option here in the sub menu. As you can notice, we have show the structure as well as color the BG, which means the background. So first and foremost, we can toggle the structure on or off. The structure is these lines that you're seeing here. Please note this is absolutely not any form of a zigzag indicator. Whereas it is defining market structure, there is a lot of working components to achieve what we desire. For example, we would like to determine a difference in trends versus ranging markets. And we indeed can accomplish that. As you can see, here is a good example of it. This entire swing here, which is rather major, is completely disregarded as if it doesn't exist simply because there is no trend at that point. It is range bound. So this will indeed do that for you, as I believe you'll come to find that quite useful. Now, of course, we can color the background as mentioned. On that, we simply need to left click and it will do so. We can make alterations to these colors. Again, we'll cover that later in the presentation. The next being our power zone. Much like the fib zones, the power zone is also a draw tool, which we'll be covering later. But again, let's go ahead and knock out the submenu here. We have multiple toggles, price labels, of course. We now know what those are for each item. The volume ratio we discussed earlier with the zones. We know what the volume ratio is. However, that is also included in our manual draw tool, as well as our value area high-low, point of control. We can also extend the profile as well as the value area and point of control. Next, we have our data box, and this is something we haven't seen before. So if we go into the submenu and we left-click Show Data Box, and here you can see the data box actually contains a lot of useful information. First, it defines the instrument in which we're analyzing. It also contains details for both our short and or long potential trade. Towards the bottom, you'll see our order flow analysis in real time. So you can actually see this moving as we speak. The data information here is going to correspond with the settings which you have input in the order inputs, and we will be covering that throughout the remainder of this presentation. Again, for now, let's focus on what this actually has so that when we circle back to it, you'll be well aware of how to use it. We have a stop price, entry, as well as up to 3 targets. As you can see here, target 2 and target 3 are essentially the same because we've specified that in our settings. Again, don't get wrapped up on that now. We're going to circle back to this. The same for our long. Of course, we have the stop, entry, as well as up to 3 targets. We also have a trail stop for both the short and the long side. So those can be utilized as well. Now, let's go back up to the menu. I'm going to hover over Trade Data Box, and there is an additional option here, Use Trend ID. We haven't gotten to the Trend ID yet, so let's go ahead and move forward, and we'll circle back to that in just one moment. Next, the Trail Stop. Notice we have multiple time frame capabilities here as well. So you're going to see this in many of our different tools, and each of them really functions the same, meaning that default is always going to be equivalent of the data series on the chart, in this case 240 minute. However, if we select any other option, then the user value here becomes relevant. So in this case, it's irrelevant because we've selected default. However, if I make an alteration here and select minute, now this becomes usable, and I'm asking it to show me a 60-minute trail stop, as opposed to the default, which is 240 minute. So once I've made the time frame selection, I want to make my further selection here of the ATR or swing. So this is what's going to be used for calculating the actual trail stop in itself, therefore printing it on your chart. We can use an ATR, which is an acronym of average true range. We've made unique alterations to that to make it user-friendly and easy to view on your chart. And we also have a simple swing option. The point here is to make it visual. Now, when these calculations are altered, that's to say the time frame and or the ATR versus swing, we're then going to need to reload the settings to re-alter those calculations. So I can left-click Reload Settings, and all of that will be then displayed properly. The trail stop is the simple toggle. Do I wish to see this on my chart, yes or no? So currently I have set to default, which means I want a 4-hour ATR version of the trail stop. So if I left-click, that's exactly what you'll see on the price chart. If I wanted to see the swing, I would thereby need to left-click the Reload Settings, and then I would also see the swing as opposed to the ATR version. Now I can toggle that back off at any time. The Trend ID, which I mentioned moments ago, also contains multiple time frame functionality. Moving beyond that, as we now know how this functions, I'm going to move down to the toggle. If I left-click, as you can see here, we now see that all of the bars are being color-coded. So the Trend ID is essentially a collaboration of moving averages and further algorithms to help us determine what the direction of the market is. I can toggle that, as you can see, on or off at any time. Again, I can make multiple time frame changes to this, so if I want to determine the direction for all intensive purposes from a daily chart, I would select day with a value of 1, left-click Reload, and now the bars would be colored upon the corresponding direction of the daily time frame. No longer would it be set to the 4-hour. So I'll go back down, and I made mention earlier that we would circle back. Now the Trend ID is built into the data box. So if I go back, any alteration that I make here, we're going to go back to the data box here and select Use Trend ID. This is asking you, do you want to differentiate trend following versus counter trend trades in the data box? If I left click Use Trend ID, I want you to take note of the values here. And as you can see, it is indeed changing. Okay? If I have that enabled, it's saying yes, show me the trend following, which in this case would be long as the bars are green. So that's why you don't see this one changing. However, if you're looking at the short details, any trade that comes in contact would indeed be counter trend based on the bar color. So if I disable that, however, now we can see that they're going to remain the same. So again, I can toggle that on or off at any given time. And as I mentioned earlier, we are going to indeed circle back to this ever so slightly when we move into the order inputs, because it's important to understand how we're arriving at these specific numbers. Because as you can see here, target 1, 31262, is different from target 1 of the long trade, 33427. There's a definitive reason for that, and that's simply based on our inputs that we will be discussing further in the presentation. As we're getting here to the final item, our trend lines, if we move into the submenu here, we'll notice yet again multiple time frame capabilities, and we'll also notice an additional selector here, trend lines versus SR lines. Now SR lines is support and resistance. The difference here is that the dynamics or structure is required utilizing the trend lines. However, with support and resistance lines, not so much. It is not required to break structure. Support and resistance is a bit more dynamic. So you can make those alterations, and I would strongly encourage you to play with both of them. Ultimately, trend lines will require structure to be broken. We can left click reload settings, and therefore it will display exactly as we've requested. We have, of course, the toggles of both as well as up and down trend. And if we also go down into the submenu, the last item here actually has its own submenu. And we can toggle both of the historical up and or down trend lines as well. So not only are we capable of seeing the real-time trend lines as they are in effect currently, but we can also go ahead and show the historical trend lines which have been previously displayed and they're further broken or violated, if you will. And finally, we have one option here to reset the template. We're going to also cover this item as we go further throughout the presentation, as it will have a pretty large impact on any changes that you may or may not want to make to your chart.